It's a great pleasure now to introduce the Revd Michael Roberts. Michael is Church of England vicar, and he's a part-time tutor for the Open Theological College and an honorary fellow in history at Lancaster University. He read geology at Oriel College, Oxford, and theology at Cranmer Hall, Durham, and was ordained in 1974. Michael is really a model of a 19th century English scholar priest, I think.
I doubt it.
It's such a hard model to imitate these days. I've tried it and I know. So to be a scholar and a busy parish priest these days is no mean undertaking. And yet Michael has done immense work in the history of geology in the 19th century, and also this whole area that he's going to unpack for us today about the reception of Darwinism. And he's going now to talk to us about From Darwin to Stokes.
Yes, right. I must admit, I was finding it a little bit hot before, and I couldn't help thinking of what happened in that little discussion, which has attracted to us almost more mythology than any other incident, including all the Galileo affair, the Huxley-Wilberforce debate, so-called, in the end of June 1860. And there, of course, they bring out all sorts of things. There was Fitzroy waving his Bible around, and particularly Lady Brewster fainted. I just hope nobody does that. If so, they'll have to be carried out. But there are all sorts of things, and my favourite little bit of responses to Darwin is what the Bishop of Worcester's wife said when she went down the road and saw copies of The Origin of Species in a bookshop. She said, "I just hope that it isn't true. And if it is true, I hope the lower classes don't hear of it." Now, there's only one problem there, is that I think if anybody can provide the references for that, I think they should get a refund on this course. Are you willing to offer that? I think I would. And just a minute, I had just forgotten one other thing. And of course, we have this whole picture of the antagonism between evolution and Christianity, the two being totally at loggerheads. And of course, this whole business about the response of the Christian church to Darwin attracts an incredible amount of myth. It's sort of ingrained into the popular psyche, and if you ever dare challenge it, you are going to be told you are wrong. And you can't do anything about it if you say, "Look, I'm sorry, but I've read all the accounts on the meeting in Oxford. I've read loads of letters by various people in connection with The Origin of Species." It's not true. And of course, you find the absolute heart of it is in the Huxley-Wilberforce confrontation of 1860, which actually been demythologized so many times by Lucas, Brooke, James over the last 30 years that there's very little excuse for anyone to still support it. But of course, it is still supported, and now we have it coming out in our GCSE science textbooks, published, what was it, this year, was it? I have been lent it. Very new, highly reputable, University of York Science Education Group, Nothing Curriculum Centre, OCR, not sure what that stands for. It's one of the examining boards, and Oxford University Press. It doesn't say much for Oxford, I'm afraid to say. And here it comes out very, very strongly in this. I may touch on it later, but it comes out with the usual howlers and mistakes, with the people who did it obviously had not done their homework. But the other thing is is this whole conflict thesis of science and religion. The two are at loggerheads. And that particularly comes out in memoirs of people like Thomas Huxley, writing in the 1890s, when in fact he got his knuckles rapped by saying how he slaughtered Samuel Wilberforce by people who were there, said, "I was there, you didn't do it." And also in the two classic books, first by John Draper and the other by Andrew Dixon White, The Warfare of hang on, I've got to get the thing. The Warfare of Theology with Science. I think I've got the title right. It is at the back in my references. Yes, The Warfare of Science with Theology. And it sort of got produced in various times from the late 1870s and its sort of definitive form in 1896. A most fascinating book, a book which is worth checking out the references just to see if you can find any of the references which are, in fact, correct. My favourite one on that is where he refers to Samuel Wilberforce and gives 7 quotations from Samuel Wilberforce's review of The Origin of Species. So, as I got the copy of it, 40 pages of it, I just went through with a tooth comb and just checked the references. Sometimes people can do very pedantic and silly things. I found that 6 of them out of the 7 were totally and utterly wrong, and the 7th was in fact a misquotation. And it does make you wonder a little bit. And of course, this mythology shows very little sign of dying, and it just seems to crop up time and time again, and it is the popular perception. And we have to be careful of the other extreme, and Hedley Brooke, in his book Science and Religion, Some Historical Perspectives, does warn that if you go to the other side and try and pretend there was no conflict, you are equally false. So I'm having a slight problem here. Is this anywhere raising this? Because it's right at my... I'll have to hold this like this, partly because some people might say, old age, my eyes aren't as good as they ought to be. And there was the conflict, a minor conflict, but it was not as White argued. And then we can also go much further and see Ted Larson, who wrote up on the Scopes trial in a most brilliant way, and demonstrating there that, in fact, this conflict thesis of science and religion moulded all the events around the Scopes trial of 1926, and I think it could be argued is a significant cause of the late 20th century rise of young Earth creationism and the culture wars, particularly as they're raging in the United States at the moment. And then we can also turn that conflict thesis upside down and inside out, so that we reverse the roles of goodies and baddies. And this is in fact coming out in some of the young Earth perspective on the history of science. And a very good example is some of Terry Mortenson's work. He's one of the activists, employees, or whatever you call him, in Answers in Genesis. And of course he wrote a thesis for Coventry University some 10 years ago on the so-called scriptural geologists of from about 1817 to about 1850, who tried to argue a young Earth perspective then. And there everything is turned around, because all of geology is seen as one of the dark fruits of the Enlightenment. And his book, which you find in the references, does in fact develop that. But one of the important things to do is to separate this popular perception of both the responses of geology and evolution from the, what you might call, the general historical picture, which has emerged from the history of science over the last 3 decades. The two are very different. The popular perception, the received version, and what is coming out in the history of science over the last 3 decades. I'm not arguing for total unanimity among scholars, but there is a certain level of consensus. And apologies, I'm only dealing with Christians from Britain and America. I'm ignoring all those from the continent, and those who are from the continent will realise that some British people have a habit of describing the continent as Europe, implying Britain is not part of Europe. There's some problems here with Britain, but we will not go into it. And I'm also not discussing the wider Roman Catholic response. So let's just see how things came about. That in one sense, we're dealing with a relatively short period of time in which there was a great advance in the understanding of the time that this planet has existed. Of course, the iconic estimate on the age of the Earth is Archbishop Usher in about 1655 with his calculation of 4004 BC. And then we only go forward 204 years, and I'm calling it 200 years because, like a geologist, I always round things to the nice convenient figure with a plus and minus thing, that we really have about a period of 200 years moving from where the Earth was pretty clearly young to which it had to be millions and millions of years old. And that is not such an incredible length of time. And also, if we go back to the 17th century, we also have the thing that there were questions whether the fossils were living organisms, and also whether caterpillars turned into butterflies. Remember that Calvin put down caterpillars as noxious creatures, not very nice, and people didn't realise that. And of course, in the 17th century, if anything, people reckoned that the flood laid down all the strata. And so we move into the 18th century, because during that century, the age of the Earth became apparent. And we cannot say that it didn't happen until about 1800. It was been developing right the way through the century, and in fact going back into the 17th as well. But the main controversy of the 18th century was not between Archbishop Usher's age of 4004 BC versus millions of years, which is the popular mythology, whether we take the scientific view or the young Earth creationist view, but whether the Earth was eternal or ancient. And that is very, very different. And Hutton was often perceived as considering the Earth to be eternal, but in fact was rather more deistic than that. But there were others who said the Earth had to be eternal. And then he was particularly opposed by one of the leading geologists of his day, the Swiss Jean-André Deluc. Sorry, my French is not very good, but I think it's better than Winston Churchill's. And although he often gets very maligned, he was a Christian geologist, did some very effective geological work, and wrote tomes and tomes of stuff. And despite the fact he was living in England, he was the tutor to King George III's Queen, and he was reckoning that the Earth was by no means young, tens of thousands of years, possibly in excess of 100,000, and also all this was in conformity with Genesis. And in that period, up to 1800, very few held to a young Earth, and it's amazing how few you actually find. If they do, they're not very dogmatic about it. Those who went into the scientific arguments, in fact, held it was much older. Exactly how old? A diversity of opinion. And then we need to see how this was all coming out. And Martin Rudwick, in his magnificent book, Bursting the Limits of Time, and in other books, or another article, reckons that Deluc was instrumental in enabling Christians to accept geology, and also, in a sense, developed what Usher was trying to do, all with a minor adjustment to the interpretation of Genesis. So when we move to the 1820s, virtually all geologists accepted millions of years, including Christian geologists like Sedgwick, Buckland, Conybeare, Henslow, and the Americans Hitchcock and Silliman. Conybeare just referred to the Earth being quadrillions of years old, rather in excess what any geologist would say today. Most were catastrophists, but we will find that Lyell's uniformitarianism, which came in the 1830s, had it had no effect on understandings of the age of the Earth. And any discussion on the history of geology which only refers to Hutton and Lyell is best ignored because it leaves out so much. Right, catastrophists, sorry about that. Catastrophism is saying that most of the time the Earth was fairly static, and every so often things would be deposited at a very rapid rate. Uniformitarianism, I'm going very oversimplified, is saying that everything happens at a slow, gradual rate. Does that help? Yeah, that's really it. But often it's sort of can come out rather polarized. And so, as we come up into the middle of the 19th century, the Church did not hold to a literal Genesis. So it was not the geologists who forced the church to change in about 1800. It never didn't need to change. And of course they had various interpretations of Genesis which enabled them to allow a much greater length of time. Whether the ruin restoration interpretation, which is sort of got developed into the gap theory of Chalmers, and then later in sort of a more literalistic form with Schofield and his reference Bible, or a day-age view, or something else. And by the mid-19th century, the gap theory was being rejected by many people in favour of more poetic interpretations. And then what about evolution? Well, there had been attempts by Lamarck and Erasmus Darwin in about 1800. They were not accepted because of the limited science behind it, and also they were perceived as materialist, and even worse than that, Jacobin. In other words, they could be seen as associated with the French Revolution, and people didn't want that, and particularly in England. And so, 1843, Christian Chambers published his Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, with a rather deistic view of evolution, scientifically weak, but it did open up many things, and Jim Seccord's book, Victorian Sensation, deals with that very well. Many objected to it, including Thomas Huxley, Hugh Miller, and Adam Sedgwick. And so we will move on to the response to the origin of species. And here we will find that there is no absolutely simple response by anyone, and we cannot just categorize people into scientists and Christians, because so often they overlapped. By 1859, very, very few educated Christians still accepted a literal Genesis, so that Darwin did not destroy belief in Genesis. And so when you look at that, which I can hardly see from here, when you look at the religious objections, and I would have the first one, contrary to Genesis, meaning a literal Genesis, there is absolutely no one, or not quite no one, there's virtually no one who would argue that in 1859. And the only exception I can find to that is somebody who is a brethren, an associate of J.N. Darby, B.W. Newton, who would argue for literal Genesis. Every other response was quite happy with geological time. And then, of course, it's said it's also because of cruelty of nature. The problem of, call it natural eviling, suffering and everything like that, was not seen as a problem, as that was generally accepted as conformable with the goodness of God, going right back to William Paley. And so let's just look very briefly at some of what were the objections to evolution at that time. The religious objections really come from that last... Sorry, I think I still need the same one, if I could, please. And I have got one written at different materialism at the bottom. Good, I got that. And running through them are really 3 to 8, where we have what largely Christians and sometimes Unitarians felt were the objections to evolution. Forget the first two, they didn't say that. They tend to feel that natural selection was too much, as Herschel called it, the law of higgledy-piggledy, so that would imply no God. And continuing that, there'd be no purpose in it, thus no God. Chance, no God. So it's this sort of random part of it which really implies it does exclude God. And then 3 other ones as well. Descended from animals, therefore we are animals, and it destroys the moral base of human life. So it takes away our morality. And then it could also be seen that the whole idea of evolution, that apes evolve into humans. I won't go into details, and I know Darwin did not mention that in The Origin of Species, but it was soon understood that he did hold it, is that there could be no fall and therefore no atonement. And lastly, it was perceived as materialistic, and that means generally atheistic, and hence it needed to be shunned. Those were the main features of the objections from a religious point of view. But there are also very strongly the non-religious objections, and here it was often seen to be associated with radical politics. And this came out particularly in two of the main Christian objectors to evolution, Adam Sedgwick and Samuel Wilberforce. Sedgwick brought it out in a letter he wrote to Darwin, which in fact he did famously signed himself off as the son of a monkey. So you need to put that in context with the criticisms, because often it is brought out that Sedgwick was very critical of The Origin of Species. But remember, Sedgwick had taught Darwin a tremendous amount of geology in 1831. They kept more or less in touch, and then when he wrote the letter, he criticised Darwin and then signed it, son of a monkey. So it does put that into context. It does not take away Sedgwick's disagreement of him. And in Wilberforce's critique of The Origin of Species, some 40 pages in the Quarterly Review, with great big chunks of quotations, which completely contradicts the view that Wilberforce never read The Origin of Species. Yes, he did. He read it so well he could find all the apt quotes as well. And in that he made a reference to Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, being a bit of a Jacobin, too sympathetic to what was going on in revolutionary France. Geological objections. Wilberforce brought that out. The geologists were not too happy, and particularly that Darwin was in fact arguing for great gaps in the geological record, and saying that what we have in the geological record, if we say have a series of strata, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or whatever it is, he would say that in between the deposition of each layer, there was a long period of time, probably far longer than actually deposited the rocks, before the next one came down. And geologists at that time would not accept it. The vast majority felt Darwin was totally wrong there, and it only took a certain amount of time before geologists came round to Darwin's position. And remember, Darwin was a geologist before he was a biologist. Perhaps he had been reading too much in and went beyond all the evidence which was available at the time, but in fact he did turn out that he was justified in arguing these gaps, so that what we have in the geological record is only a partial record of what happened throughout time. And most of the geologists at that time objected to evolution. Objections of physics. The physicists were extremely strong in opposing evolution. I'll be looking at those on the list of people I want to put up in a moment. And then there were those who, carrying on from Peter's talk, they objected to Darwin that he was not giving proper, true, empirical Baconian science. And Sedgwick just told Darwin quite bluntly in the letter, "You have departed from Baconian science, from the tram lines of Baconian science," or something like that, and then went on to say that you have erected a structure as fanciful as Bishop Wilkins' machine to get to the moon, going back again to the 16th century. So there we have some of the basic reasons why people were objecting to evolution at that time. I think I've done the next sheet, but we also need to balance this by seeing some of the appeal of evolution. Can you see the one which says appeal on evolution? And I think we sometimes feel that it's a bit simple, particularly from today's perspective. But even then, it did make a tremendous appeal, making sense of the fossil record with all the succession of life. And Darwin, in, I think it was his 1842 essay on evolution, there were these two from 1842 and 1844, which are quite, and in some ways I prefer to The Origin because they're not only briefer, they're much more pungent in the way they express things. And there he says, it's rather odd that you get in the fossil record this succession of species where you can say one seems to be a precursor of the others, that it sort of makes more sense that they are, that each successive species is derived from what was older than it, than to say that God came in and created another species every so often. It made sense of other things like variation, hybrids, biogeography, classification, vestigial organs, and everything like this. And the main appeal, I think, was that it sort of eliminated the appeal, the need for this multiplicity of creations. A French geologist, Daubigny, who gave the concept of a geological stage in the 1850s, argued that in just one part of the Jurassic strata, and he worked this out on the Normandy beaches not far from Arromanches, that there would need to be 17 successive creations in one part of the Jurassic. And if you multiply that for the whole of everything after the Precambrian, you end up that there had to be about something like 1,000 or so creations, getting rather a lot, postulating one creation after another. So you end up with what Darwin was challenging at his time. It wasn't just a few creations in 6 days, but thousands in geological time, which the progressive creation of a Sedgwick or anyone else would require. But then also think that it's only one step to go from this progressive creationism with all these many steps into just saying it's a general evolutionary procession. And of course the understandings of Genesis did not need that much alteration because they'd moved well away from a literal Genesis. Appeal to things like Victorian ideas of progress, and of course evolution was in the air. And the whole understanding of design in the simple idea of Paley had in fact started to crumble way back in the 1820s. And so of course Darwin could make much on, in The Origin of Species, sort of having this sort of straw man of the ordinary, I must get the terminology right. Sorry, I can't find it. It's the ordinary view of creation, where he was using this throughout The Origin of Species. He wasn't meaning a 6-day creation, but he was meaning this sort of progressive creation over millions of years. And it was a very effective rhetorical device to make people think and say, this is not quite right, so that they could make Darwin's thesis much more acceptable. And so you find this variation of acceptance within the community, both scientific and religious, and you can't really separate the two, because so many of the scientists were Christians or even clergymen. And I think if I can ask for the next one, is that the... I'm not a very constructive one here, am I? And I thought here, by just looking at... Then you got this all on your sheets, where I have a provisional list of responses to Darwin in the early 1860s. And I have both the scientist response and the clergy response. And if you look at the two sheets and you put them together, you'll suddenly you won't suddenly realise, you'll notice that many of them are one and the same. And you can look through and see that I put them in 4 categories. Those who accepted evolution, those who weren't convinced either way, those who accepted geology but rejected evolution, and those who rejected both geology and evolution. No, you just about need the bottom one on. There is one on that list. Of those who had got any scientific status, who rejected both geology and evolution, the only one was Philip Goss, the ex-Plymouth Brethren naturalist, who is sort of very cruelly criticised in his son's book, Father and Son, which is another version of the conflict thesis. But virtually all of these, if you look at them, there are quite a few Americans, and the rest are British. And I think nearly all of the British ones are in fact Fellows of the Royal Society. I think some might say it was easier to become FRSs then than today. And you cannot say that it was just the more able who accepted evolution. Because when you look at those who accepted geology but rejected evolution, you've got all the geologists, you've got the physicists, whether David Brewster, Kelvin, Fleming-Jenkin, Tate, Clerk Maxwell, Faraday, and Joule. They all had their questions, partly because I think they were more at home with an experimental science rather than a non-experimental science, which biology often is, and particularly was at that time. I dealt with the geologist's exception. But then we have those who accepted evolution. A very interesting case study is H.B. Tristram, who, as you see, pops up 3 times. He pops up there as well. You lost him. H.B. Tristram was an ornithologist who was canon of Durham and a vicar just outside Durham. He was also a strong evangelical. And when he read the Darwin-Wallace papers in 1858, he thought, this is wonderful. It explains so much. And he then used their ideas in explaining some of the larks he had been observing in the Holy Land just about that time. So in fact, the first paper written using the Darwin-Wallace ideas was published by an evangelical clergyman, which is rather interesting. But then, in 1860, he went to the British Association, and he heard the, whatever it was, the conflict between Hooker and Huxley, along with Wilberforce. And he came away from that saying he no longer believed in evolution. And a year or 2 later, he changed his mind again, so much so that he was reported by his family often to say about animals being involved, sorry, created. He could not, he sort of was there, really there. And you see this sort of toing and froing. It wasn't as easy as that, just do it. And then some of the others who accepted evolution, well, you have Babington, a botanist, who was botany professor in Cambridge, I think took over in 1863 after Henslow. And he was very much an evangelical, and he was the one who commissioned the Cambridge 7, the missionaries who went out to China, I think, in the 1880s. Very strong evangelical. You have people like Asa Gray from Harvard. I think he can just about be called an evangelical. I'm not too sure of that. But then there are those who wouldn't know whether they'd call me an evangelical or not, but we won't go into that. And you've then got a mixture of people who were Christian, clearly Christian, and those who had more who were not, like Tyndall, Huxley, Hooker, Galton, who were very much turned out what Huxley would call them all agnostics. You had some who weren't convinced either way, and people like Lyell later was. But if you have a look at that, I've got those various blobs. All the green blobs are people who would be regarded as evangelical. The blue blobs are simply those who are quite clearly Christian of one form or another. But just before we go from that, in about 1860, 2 people there worked out some calculations on the age of the Earth. If you look at the top, there was Thomas Huxley, and if you look at the bottom, there was the Reverend Samuel Horton, the first on the list, Professor of Geology at Dublin, who wrote a very critical review of The Origin of Species, and in about the same time they each worked out their calculation on the age of the Earth. One of them said the Earth was only about 100 million years old, and the other said that the base of the Cambrian was 1800 million years old. Is anybody going to hazard a guess which way round? No. Come on, Bob, you have a go.
I'm sure it's the other way from what we expect.
You are. Samuel Horton said 1800 for the base of the Cambrian. We only reckon 550 million now, and Huxley was on the much higher figure. And so we get this very much variation. It wasn't the simple scientist versus clergy as so often comes out. Well, I think now just see roughly how things developed. That fairly soon after that, more and more began to accept evolution. In the early 1860s, the Victoria Institute was founded, partly to counteract some of the less desirable effects of modern science, and particularly in the wake of The Origin of Species and things like that. Yet, in the second year of publication in 1865, one of the papers by George Warrington argued very strongly for evolution, despite the fact that, among others, Philip Goss was one of the founders of the Victoria Institute. And so, over the next few years, more and more within the Christian Church began to accept evolution. And so you can say by about 1870, even 1870, it was very much accepted throughout Europe and America in one form or another, not always in a Darwinian form. Of the more conservative, particularly evangelicals, they had a tendency to reject evolution rather longer than others, but they always accepted geology. And if we look at that period from 1870 to 1900, we will find there are hardly any people who wrote about it, and that is the problem, who wrote about it, who would insist on a young Earth, and most of these were in fact Germanic Midwest Lutherans, forerunners of the Missouri Synod. But remember, they also held to geocentricity at that time, and you found the odd evangelical popping up time to time arguing for a young Earth, like the Lord Brothers in the States. There was, I'm not going to go into this because I might run out of time. I think I will if I'm not careful. An interesting controversy between Asa Gray, who was a convinced evolutionist, and Charles Hodge, the Princeton Presbyterian theologian, on evolution was a result of Hodge's What is Darwinism, which I think is the most carefully structured and most reasonable anti-evolution book ever written. That's not bad for a book which was written over 130 years ago. But then, when we look at that Princeton school of Hodge, Hodge couldn't quite accept evolution, but he did say it was possible for someone to accept evolution, providing they didn't do so in a Darwinian fashion and accept natural selection. His son, Archibald Hodge, came to accept evolution, and his disciple, B.B. Warfield, who died in 1921, was quite strongly pro-Darwinian. And this is quite interesting, as they were the school which basically gave a very strictly formulated doctrine of biblical inerrancy. So biblical inerrancy in the original form could go with evolution. And what we find is that come the 1880s, it was just standard practice that most Christians would accept some kind of evolution. Frederick Temple, who was later Archbishop of Canterbury, gave the 1884 Bampton Lectures. Often that is portrayed as this is how the church moved, but in fact he gave a sermon accepting evolution at the British Association in 1860. But there was one proviso that many Christians accepted evolution rather than Darwinism. They favoured a directed evolution rather than the law of higgledy-piggledy as Darwin was supposed to have, where they would not accept natural selection, but also a direct creation at 3 points: the formation of life, the first sentient beings, and then humans. And a good example is the Scottish theologian James Orr, whose work is still well worth looking at. And of course this fitted in with the late 19th century ideas of evolution, which were non-Darwinian, non-selectionist, and favoured some kind of guiding principle behind it. And you'll find this coming out in some of the American paleontologists like Cope, the ones who worked on the dinosaurs in the Midwest. You'll also find that the acceptance or not of evolution was not simply one of science and religion, but because influenced by cultural and regional factors as well. And this particularly comes out in some work of David Livingstone, comparing Presbyterians in Scotland, Ulster, and the northeast of America, Princeton, and which is even more interesting as I want to add the southern states as well. Because their theology was all the same, Calvinistic Presbyterian view, and they differed. The Scottish Presbyterians very largely accepted evolution with 1 or 2 exceptions. Princeton, or rather the New England Presbyterians, also accepted evolution more and more, particularly after Charles Hodge died. In Ulster, they tended to be antagonistic to evolution, even though they were old Earth. And that may have been because of John Tyndall having a very scathing anti-religious speech at the British Association in the early 1870s. Then we move to the south. The Southern Presbyterians still tended to be anti-evolution. In the 1860s, we had people like Dabney and Thornwell were still arguing for 6-day creation, and I think part of that is related to their acceptance of slavery. And of course you had others who were losing positions in universities in the South because of their acceptance of evolution. Well, if we end up just in the end of the 19th century, and we could stop time in 1900, we would note that nearly all Christians, evangelicals included, had all accepted deep time, and most had accepted evolution. It comes a little bit more clearly if we consider those series of a dozen brown paper-covered booklets which came out in 1910 called the Fundamentals, from which we get the term fundamentalist. And there they have a general acceptance of science, and also with some of them, particularly James Orr, an acceptance of evolution. And yet, within 10 years of that, anti-evolutionism was rife in the United States. And the question is why? And perhaps then we need to move to the rise of anti-evolution in the United States in the period up to the Scopes trial of 1926. To every complex question, there is a simple answer, and that is wrong. So said Oscar Wilde, and that is the danger of looking at something else like this. And if you watch the film version of Inherit the Wind, you will realize that there's only one good reason, and that is because of the old-time religion of the Deep South. Nonsense. Watch that hymn for entertainment, and never watch it for any portrayal of what happened. In fact, the whole of the Scopes trial was far more amusing than that film was, because it had elements of deep farce. In 1900, the Christian map of the United States was very varied, and underneath the confident face of both liberal and evangelical optimism, there were several forces at work which became apparent over the next 2 decades. George Frederick Wright was a congregational minister who became very friendly with Asa Gray in the 1870s. He developed a Christian Darwinism approach and also was a very competent glacial geologist. And so he was one of the foremost proponents of evolution. But in the 1890s, he began to change. He first of all started opposing biblical criticism of any form and realized this would have implications on his scientific understanding. But he also reckoned that some geological estimates for time were far, far too long. And in 1896, he wrote a very useful book in many ways. I've got it, and I do enjoy using it, called Man and the Glacial Period, in which he argued that there'd only been one ice age, as opposed to the many, and that humans had only been around for about 20,000 years. He had wanted to shorten geological time, and one of the reasons for that was so that he could retain a very conservative interpretation of Genesis. And so he gradually moved from being a Christian Darwinist to being almost a fundamentalist. And Ron Numbers, in his book The Creationist, has an interesting essay on that. And then, almost behind the scenes and away from everybody, were the Seventh-day Adventists. Of course, they started as a breakaway from the Millerites in the mid-19th century with Ellen White as the leader, and she was very much the prophet of them, and her writings were rather visionary, rather literalist, and formed the basis of Seventh-day Adventist belief. And it's quite interesting reading her book on the prophets and patriarchs with her understanding of what happened in the flood, with volcanoes popping up everywhere. I think any geologist ought to read it just for slight amusement. And she wanted to make this a basis of Seventh-day Adventist belief. And there were two early followers in particular. One was somebody who'd got trained as a doctor, a man by the surname of Kellogg, who was also into health foods, and he invented cornflakes and peanut butter. But he also wrote a pro-evolutionary book, so he wasn't too popular with the Seventh-day Adventist movement. And the other was George Macready Price, a man of very little education. I think he did about one college course in science in his whole time. And from 1905, he wrote a whole spate of books with titles like The New Geology, Illogical Geology, and everything else, in which, as a result of Seventh-day Adventist belief, he would try to argue that the whole of geology was wrong. And to keep any geologist happy, he pointed out that the geological periods can be found in any order whatsoever, that the unusual understanding of Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, it wasn't the case. They could equally well be Cambrian, Devonian, Silurian, or whatever have you. And his books actually had quite a considerable effect in the early 20th century. He didn't convince that many, but I think he unsettled many and opened the way for young earth creationism. The next is dispensationalism. This particular development of understandings of biblical prophecy in the 19th century, various forms of millenarianism, where they have these 7 dispensations, and also taking all the prophetic books of the Bible very literally, and having, what's going to happen at the end. There's going to be the millennium, and it's preceded by all sorts of things, either pre-tribulationist or anything else. I won't go into great detail, because whenever I read them, I can never remember the details. And so they had a very literalist understanding of the whole of the Bible, but Schofield did in fact support the gap theory on Genesis and accepted geological time. The main thing it did was to give evangelicals really a default literalist biblical hermeneutic. So evangelicals had a tendency to be literalist. And so we have other factors as well, which I note down. You have biblical criticism, and some forms of biblical criticism in the late 19th century could be quite extreme. And that meant if you want to oppose something, you've got to go to the other extreme. During the First World War, the perception that German militarism was Darwinian, therefore Darwinianism need to be opposed. Another one is the rise of eugenics. Eugenics became quite popular in the early decades of last century. It was supported by particularly those who are evolutionists and also modernist theologians. And many of the fundamentalists, including William Jennings Bryan, were totally opposed to eugenics, and hence they also opposed evolution. And can you see that they've now occupied the high moral ground because they oppose to eugenics? General reservations about evolution, and you also had the marginalization of evangelicals after the First World War because of the modernist takeover of many denominations, and that resulted in a fortress mentality. And then the conflict thesis of science and religion being regarded as actuality by both sides, both the fundamentalist and what you might call the general modernist view in theology, and also the scientific community, all aided and abetted by an increasing amount of scientific ignorance. They're all discussed by Numbers, and I find Numbers' book on the creationists is absolutely wonderful, but I'd put on another one as well, which I think needs to be developed, is that many evangelicals wanted to limit the time humans had been on Earth. Before radiometric dating was developed in 1905, it was possible to argue for 10,000 years for human history, as did G.F. Wright, even though Lyell from 1864 or so was saying that humans been around for 100,000 years. And you can see if you have only 10,000 years for human history, you can have a literal interpretation of Genesis 3 to 11 and almost a literal interpretation of Genesis 1. But soon the Earth was being estimated as being billions of years old, in 1915 as 1.8 billion, and that immediately meant that humans had to be around for a good 100,000 years. So Genesis could not be literal. And I think that point needs to be developed more, and I'd like to do so. And of course, the coalescing of all these factors in the 1920s prepared the way for the Scopes trial, and also the anti-evolutionism, which was usually old Earth, of the interwar years. It also prepared the ground for young Earth creationism to take root after Morris and Whitcomb published The Genesis Flood in 1961. This is largely American. The influence of anti-evolutionism in Britain between the wars was pretty limited, and the influence of young Earth creationism was limited until about 20 odd years ago. And of course, matters came to a head in the summer of 1926 with the Scopes trial. And there you have a most odd thing, that William Jennings Bryan was in fact someone who believed strongly in an old Earth. He was quite happy to accept evolution up to apes, but not for humans. And that is something which is often overlooked. But you must read Larson's book about it, because it is quite entertaining. And I think the most entertaining thing of the Scopes trial was one afternoon when the temperatures were rather hotter than today. There was one of the prosecuting lawyers was missing, along with Mr. Scopes himself. And they rolled in late together. They'd gone up into the mountains to swim in a lake. How you could ever visualize a court case when one of the prosecuting lawyers and the person being charged decide to go out for a swim together in the middle of it all at lunch break is quite amusing. But one of the main results of the Scopes trial was that the late Victorian Christian acceptance of evolution had gone forever.
I think we have got time for one or two questions before dinner, and of course more can be put on the slips for later on in the box outside. So, any questions for Michael? Yes.
It's in order in case I have to refer to something quickly. It's only bound to trip me up. I didn't keep very closely to my script.
Just a minor historical detail, but I just want to clarify. You had Michael Faraday, since it's the Faraday Institute, you had Michael Faraday on the anti-Darwinian list. Now we had a seminar here on Faraday a couple of months ago, and the claim was made there that Faraday never made any public reference or written reference to Darwin, but simply, as a good physicist might, just ignored him completely. I mean, but you put him on your anti-Darwinian list. Do you have some written justification? I'd be interested to hear more about that.
I should have printed off a copy of the letter I have got at home, which in fact is Faraday writing, and I can't remember who to, making it quite clear he opposed Darwin's theory of evolution.
Thank you.
If you want a copy of that, I can send it to you.
Thank you.
You didn't notice something else. Did you notice what else I did? I did put a question mark. With the Greens were evangelical, but his was it was a question mark, because I could say I'm not absolutely sure whether he was an evangelical, but that's being mischievous. You know that.
Do you make a distinction between Darwinian evolution and neo-Darwinian evolution? Did things change when it became neo-Darwinian and became well-defined with terms of mutations and more precise?
I think all the terminology never helps. That the word Darwinian is just used far too loosely. Neo-Darwinianism is particularly what you might call the post-1930s approach, with a combination of genetics, everything else, with Ernst Mayr as being, one of the chief proponents of it. So neo-Darwinism is really what's gone on, say, since 1940, and Darwinian is a much looser definition. And also, you can be accept evolution without accepting the basic Darwinian thesis, Darwin's idea that natural selection is one of the major driving forces. The terminology is what makes it difficult.
Yeah,
it's curious, isn't it? Because surely neo-Darwinianism, with mutations and all the rest of it, that ought to secure the theory, because now we know the mechanisms and all the rest of it. So that ought to make it more acceptable somehow.
Which, the term Darwinian?
No, well, the whole idea, because now we've got mechanisms and we know how genes mutate and all the rest of it. Whereas Darwin hadn't a clue as to how it actually worked.
He got no idea on genetics. He just hadn't got the first idea of genetics. There was a lot of things, and when you get the theory coming out, there were a lot of things which were not known, and Darwin was quite annoyed, where people said you haven't got sufficient evidence, because he was really making assumptions, and he came out, because he had no understanding of genetics, couldn't have. He had his ideas of blending inheritance and things like that. And in answer to criticisms, he did point out that people were quite happy to accept Clerk Maxwell's theory of the ether. Can you explain this more? You probably you ought to know it better than me. I hate when I'm next to somebody who's basically a physicist. Explain to me with his Clerk Maxwell's idea of an ether needed to propagate waves throughout space, and he'd done it purely on theoretical grounds, on no evidence. And Darwin said, well, there's no evidence for it. And ironically, there was not even no evidence, there was no ether. So he had to go beyond the evidence, as any theory does in the beginning.
Bob's got a question.
Thanks very much, Michael. Can I tease out something you said about the age of humans? Because although it's undoubtedly true that Homo sapiens is probably 150,000 years old, and carbon-14 and other dating supports that, if you take a fairly close reading of Genesis, you'd still conclude that Adam and Eve were probably only about 10,000 years old, because there was clearly agriculture, settled agriculture, going on at the time. And the oldest settled agriculture in the geological record, in the human record even, is about 10,000 years, Neolithic, 8 or 9,000 years BC maybe. So it seems to me that actually even with current geological dating, you can still hold to an age for Adam and Eve of 10,000 years.
I'm not sure I could.
If you take that argument about agriculture, so how do you respond to that?
I just find it very, very unconvincing. I know both you hold it. I think Sam Berry does as well, doesn't he?
Well, it's not just me. It's anthropologists say that the first settled agriculture.
I think it is on the first. I'm just fine. I just feel that's very unsatisfactory. I think it would take me a long time to answer that one.
Right. You don't want to say any more? I mean,
I
about Adam and Eve.
I mean, what do you find unsatisfactory? The dating of the first agriculture as 9000 BC?
I think I would take a less literal view of early Genesis, with it much more vague in its details.
But I think you were drawing out the distinction that people who did take a literal view were troubled by the fact that humans might be older. But actually, if you take a literal view, then you come to the view that maybe Adam and Eve are only 10,000 years old.
I
and
think,
so that would still fit all right. That's the issue. Not your
I've gone
problem,
through
but their
that.
problem.
I've gone through that. I just find it very unsatisfactory. I would tend to see Genesis, the first chapters of Genesis, as much more proto-history written in a highly stylized way, and I don't think you can pin it down to things like that. I think we disagree.
Well, no, if that's the case, then the age doesn't matter, does it?
No, exactly. That's probably right.
From your point of view, yes, I think that's probably correct, but I'm not convinced of the arguments. But I think particularly most people would not have seen that. They would have gone straight to there. You've still got problems with, what are those caves in France? Is it Lascaux? You know, they're about 25,000, aren't they?
Yeah, but they don't portray settled agriculture.
I just...
They portray hunting of animals.
I would not like to make a distinction of Homo sapiens 100,000 years ago and Homo sapiens when the agricultural revolution started.
Oh, well, I didn't say Homo sapiens when the agriculture. I said Adam and Eve, Homo divinus, if you like.
Yeah, I can't buy it.
Okay, I think we've tossed that one backwards.
I know.
Probably got time for another question. Yeah, Christine. With the mic.
The first track of, I would say, a philosophical questioning of death, I would say. Yes, I interpret it like that. It is the first tomb, or a group of tombs, first burials. They are 100,000 years old, from Israel. That is strange, from the Mount Carmel. And these people were anatomically sapiens, Homo sapiens, early, very early modern, or some say still archaic. The earliest people who corresponded to perhaps Homo sapiens without doubt were from South Africa, maybe 200, 300,000 years old. All had a Middle Stone Age culture, which was quite similar to that of the Neanderthals, which were of another group. I feel, that is a personal interpretation, I feel that there are some strange aspects in Genesis 3. When you see the idea of death, the idea of changing the earth, we can say work, yes, as changing the earth, the idea of opposition between humans and what is from the earth, animals, represented symbolically through a snake, and the obstetric problems, all that goes together with a big brain. And I find it rather troubling that everything is compacted together in a few verses in such an ancient book as the Bible.
I haven't looked at it that way.
So, some questions.
I haven't looked at it that way. There's some interesting ones there, and I'm not quite sure how to respond to that. I'd like to think about it. But you see, that would point to Adam and Eve the first humans going back to 200 odd thousand. But I think we're...
Microphone, please.
There are a lot of different aspects. If Adam and Eve were the first humans, I really don't know. Maybe the first humans who had personal contact with God, or who were aware of God. It is different from the biology.
Yeah. I would... It's
With
not an
Eve,
area I have looked into.
With Eve, there is another interesting thing, the story of the rib. Have you heard the book of Samuel Kramer? The history began in Sumer.
No.
No. There is one chapter which is very interesting. That was an Orientalist, and in this book he comments tablets, Sumerian tablets. And there is one story which is most striking. I try to make it very rapidly. Yes. There is somebody who is sick, and a Greek goddess sits with him, and she asks, where do you have pain? Oh, I have headache. Here is a god so and so for your head. And where do you have pain? Here is then another anatomical part, and here is a god for that anatomical part. Where do you have pain? In the rib. Here is the goddess Ninti for your rib. But there is something interesting, that Ninti means the lady of the rib, but there is a word play in the Sumerian language. Ninti means also giver of life. And Adam, at the end of chapter 3 of Genesis, says her name will be Eva because she is giver of life. So I think that this story is a recycling from a very old Sumerian story, and the idea kept and was translated into Hebrew, whereas the word play has been lost.
I would not know how to respond because I'm just not well enough up in that type of field. So I prefer...
There's a fascinating thing
Yeah.
to end this particular session with, I think. But dinner is now going to be served minus 1 minute ago. So if we can... Michael, good job.